Good morning, everyone, or evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. Or afternoon, I suppose, too. We will be getting started here shortly at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, so that's about 3 minutes.
Can we do a little, since people are here? You will need a piece of paper and a writing utensil for this presentation. If you could please have one handy, it would be very helpful.
All right, I am all set with my paper and writing utensil. Just one more minute, we'll get started here. Good morning, everyone. I have an 11 o'clock my time, so we're going to get started so that way our presenter has as much time as possible to have fun with us this morning. I am also just taking this moment to remind everyone that this is a recorded session, so I'm going to start the recording now. We are also broadcasting a stream of this session on the Online Learning Toolkit YouTube. It's a simulcast. So if you have any colleagues who are wondering if they can still get into this session this morning, please direct them there to the Online Learning Toolkit YouTube channel. So this is the webinars platform for Zoom. That is where we're holding our session this morning. If you're used to the meetings platform, this is slightly different. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an orientation to what's happening on your screen. There is a chat panel, and you will be able to chat with me this morning. I'm moderating the session. My name's Judith Dutil. I am co-founder of the Online Learning Toolkit, and I am here to enjoy the session as well as to help our presenter with moderation. I will be in the chat and responding to you there, but there's also a separate box that's called Q&A. And if you have any questions for the presenter, there will be some time at the end today where we will just focus on some questions and answers. Feel free to pop your question into the box at any time whenever you have it, and we will attend to those questions later on. This is also a session that has the transcript feature on Zoom On, so you should see some captions happening at the bottom of your screen. You have control over those. So if you click on transcripts or live transcripts, you should be able to turn them off if you find them distracting by clicking on disable auto transcription. Or it might, depending on the platform or the version you're using, it might also say hide. Okay, so any questions about the platform before we get started, go ahead and pop them into chat, and I'll be sure to check there to help you get oriented to whatever you need on your screen. The Online Learning Toolkit is pleased to bring you this presentation today. We are a small organization that specializes in facilitating what we call joyful professional development programming for educators invested in improving their online teaching. We want to have fun together in our sessions, and I'm certain that our presenter will be able to bring us some fun this morning. Webinars, campus workshops, faculty development courses, course design groups, one-to-one course design support, and community of practice are all things that we specialize in, and you can find more about our offerings on onlinelearningtoolkit.com. One of the programs that we're especially proud of is Camp Operation Online Learning. This is a 6-week course design community of practice for faculty who are developing online courses. So if you want to have some fun this summer and design your courses with us in a supportive community of practice, you can check that out at onlinelearningtoolkit.com/cool. As a reminder, I just kind of covered this, but the Q&A for today's session, there is a Q&A box in Zoom. And if you are watching over in YouTube, we'll monitor for questions over there too. And our moderator in YouTube sends the questions over to the Zoom platform. So we will be able to capture your questions there too. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our presenter this morning. Dr. Nicole Pfannenstiel is a wonderful expert in games and learning. Dr. Nicole Pfannenstiel is a digital rhetoric scholar who studies video games and literacies, digital writing, blog communities, and the use of games and play in the classroom. Her work focuses on learning through and with technology, blending play, connected learning theory, games, theories, and digital rhetoric to support learning and writing. Dr. Pfannenstiel is an assistant professor of digital media in the English department at Millersville University, where she teaches classes in web writing and content management, media literacy, digital rhetoric, rhetorical analysis, and composition. She regularly employs multimedia learning, Twitter, blogs, multimedia projects, and experiential learning to help students experience, learn from, and reflect on learning with course content to feel more comfortable and gain more experience with design and writing. Additionally, Dr. Pfannenstiel is the interim director of the Center for Academic Excellence, where she supports faculty in their teaching, research, and scholarship through faculty professional development programming. Dr. Pfannenstiel earned a PhD in rhetoric, composition, and linguistics from Arizona State University. I'm so glad that she's here today. Especially if you're on Twitter, if you take a moment to follow her at nfannon on Twitter, you will see her playing games with her students and all the different ways that she uses that platform to educate. So thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Dr. P.
Thank you so much. That introduction is always a gigantic mouthful. So I am going to share a sway. So we're here today to talk about, and Judith had a fantastic introduction on this, games and learning. And I'm focused specifically today on designing to support habits of mind. Games do a really awesome job. And this is where play comes in. And play is a huge, huge focus of what I really enjoy talking about and researching. When we talk about habits of mind, most of the habit of mind that we're developing while engaged with a game is through play, or it is play, and they're always interconnected. So Judith did the intro. I'm going to skip through that. I'm just going to do an overview real quick of what are we doing today. So I will talk about habits of mind and dispositions. Various fields use the terminology habits of mind. Other fields use dispositions. I will go back and forth between the two. We'll talk a little bit about why games, and then we'll talk about classroom learning space ideas, and I'm talking classroom as well as learning spaces. There are campus-wide learning spaces where games and these ideas can be very engaging, and there are outside of campus learning spaces where games and these ideas can be really helpful. And so I do want to try to focus not just on classrooms, although a lot of the focus will be classrooms, but learning spaces more broadly. How do we design learning spaces with playing games so that habits of mind and ways of thinking are really the focus? Then there'll be time at the end for questions and discussion to make sure that we really think through, what does this look like in your learning spaces? So we can't have a seminar on games without playing a game. So if you all will get paper and a writing utensil, that would be really helpful. What you're going to do on the paper is make a 3x3 bingo grid. So you'll have a total of 9 squares. And then I've given you the 9 words. You can put these anywhere you would like to in your bingo grid. I even gave you a free space because it's a little bit more fun if you have a space to actually decorate a little bit. So if you will right now, create a 3x3 bingo grid on your piece of paper, and then in any of the 9 squares, fill them in with the 9 words that I have currently displayed on my screen. While you all are working on that, what I want to talk about is, and I know that this was mentioned in a lot of the advertisement, what I'm using today for this presentation is Sway, and I've created a link so that you all will have access to this Sway after this session. The online learning toolkit has generously also recorded this session, and we'll share the recording with you. So you'll have the recorded session, you'll have access to this Sway, and then I also created an annotated bibliography with basically the most cited game books and play books. I put Weezing in there because he's just so fundamental for play. I focused in the annotated bibliography specifically on the books that had influenced a lot of this research. There are a bazillion and one articles that are fantastic, but not knowing the paywall access and your accessibility to those, I stuck specifically with books that will be shared with you after this session. So you'll have access to the Sway, you'll have access to the recording, and then you'll also have access to an annotated bibliography that was created to really bring together the foundational research to this work. Okay. So I think I have chatted enough. I'm hoping that you all have your 9x9 bingo grid prepared. If you are unable to play along with us, don't worry. It's just to have a fun game running alongside the session. That is all. I am happy to share articles for those who are interested. In a lot of cases, the articles are specific by disciplines, but I can absolutely share the journals. I'll also put in a plug for MAPACA, which is the Mid-Atlantic Pop Culture Association. We have a subdivision. I'm one of the co-chairs for that subdivision of the conference that's on play. And then MAPACA also hosts a journal, and we publish. It's been a while because of the pandemic, but thank you for sharing that, Judith. But we do also have a lot of discussion on play at that particular session. Okay, bingo boards are ready. We are going to move on. So we're going to talk about first habits of mind. Why are we talking about habits of mind? Why are we talking about brain research? And one of the big things for me is I am, as it was mentioned, I'm trained in composition. I teach predominantly first-year composition and advanced writing. So I'm teaching students who are not English majors how to write, but, and this is where habits of mind come in very strongly, I'm not teaching them to write academic writing, because academic writing, while a genre, has many, many, many different subgenres within it based on the discipline and then the field of study within the discipline. Most students are a major that has multiple disciplines, and then they also have a minor, which means they have at least 2 disciplinary ways of writing and ways of knowing that they need access to, plus the variety across their general educations. And so approaching the composition classroom from a perspective of habits of mind helps change and shape the way that I teach writing in really, really important ways. And so what we're talking about here is not the content knowledge. To a huge extent, composition is actually a contentless course. Direct grammar instruction is not productive. That's a whole different conversation. But beyond grammar and discussions about academic writing, there is no standard or stock content that belongs in or needs to be covered in a composition course. Instead, the content is ways of knowing. Skills like thinking skills and critical thinking come alongside the ways of knowing, but students need access to language and language patterns so that they understand how to learn about learning. They understand the pattern of intellectual behaviors that they're engaging with and how to actively remix and apply those in various situations. And this is something that games do amazingly well. There are, at the start of almost any game you play, and I myself am mostly a casual gamer. I love casual games on my phone. I have an 8-year-old. He is obsessed with, as most 8-year-olds are, Minecraft as well as Fortnite. So I play Minecraft and Fortnite with him. And the idea that I can go and play Minecraft and we'll play Minecraft creative, and then he'll think of a way of building that world, and then he'll go into Fortnite creative and think of, I have different tools, content available to me, but I still want to accomplish a very specific build that unfolds like, and he'll come up with whatever he wants. Right now he's building a Pokemon gym in creative in Fortnite. He's employing really complicated habits of mind, creativity obviously being one of the most obvious, but beyond the creativity, he's thinking through, how do I use the tools within this space, and how do I allow the space to help shape the ways that I'm thinking about what's going on here. Again, casual games do this really well. A casual phone game like Bejeweled or Candy Crush or any number of very simple to play games have to be simple to play. They have to be easily accessible, they have to be quickly understood, and they have to be engaging. Engagement in games obviously have a very fine line between engagement for learning and engagement for profit with the free to play type systems, but the ease of access, the ease of understanding, and the ways that players are encouraged to experiment with prior game knowledge is the habit of mind that we're really lifting out of games and applying into learning spaces in really positive ways. So habit of mind or dispositions are ways of thinking. At this point, most disciplines, so I know English is a discipline at the K-12 level, and then English is a discipline at the college level, have adopted very specific habits of mind and very specific patterns that go along with that. I work really closely with our amazing librarians on campus, and I've worked specifically with one person, and we've investigated the not instructional design. Oh my gosh, now I'm spacing on words. The ACRL has adopted one, and they're using the concept of dispositions specifically for how do we engage with and how do we learn online. What does it look like to have news literacy? What does it look like to have information literacy? And so the ACRL has put together habits of mind and dispositions that come along with positive approaches to information literacy and news literacy. We're talking about ways of thinking and how ways of thinking are supported through these designed structures. That is our goal. So from a disciplinary perspective or into space-specific perspectives, what we're really looking at are these series of questions. So what does it look like to think like a, and then insert the blank here because you're going to insert your field of study or your learning space. So what does it look like to think like a biologist? And we can understand and shape biologists based on the age and intellectual ability and maturity of our learners, which is really important. So what does it look like to think like a biologist? What does it look like to think like a high school biologist? What does it look like to think like a writer? And even writer is really complicated. What does it look like to think like a creative writer? Well, again, what kind of creative writing? Are we talking poetry or short story? Because those are very different genres. And so we can get really, really narrow with our focus of what does it look like to think like, and then obviously I've got write and research and argue. And then we get down to read, which is really important because a lot of these key concepts that we're coming up with for habits of mind that we're identifying as ways of thinking that are valued within discipline, but also ways of thinking that help students integrate new knowledge into a robust existing knowledge system that's very useful and accessible to them as they're working through new problems, comes down to comes down to thinking, writing, and reading, the way that we really start to build out the dispositions that we're talking about and identifying the key concepts that we're talking about or naming as a part of our habits of mind. So then we can start to really add meaningful questions like, where will students need to think like this? What do those spaces look like? And how can games model some of those spaces so that students aren't just connecting to content, but they're connecting the content to the ways of thinking that are valued, and they're practicing in a space where failure is expected, because failure is absolutely expected in games as a way of learning, where they can practice thinking like and working through the habits of mind that we're trying to instill in them. And then what will it look like when learners demonstrate that they're thinking like us? So what will it look like when learners demonstrate that they're thinking like a writer? And what will it look like when learners demonstrate that they're thinking like a biologist? What will it look like when learners demonstrate they're thinking like a chemist? And how do we start to shape some of that? And so that's where I turn specifically to games. How can games really push this is what we're looking at and this is what we're doing? So I do want to double check, because I've been saying words on your bingo card. As I've said the words that you've listed on your bingo card, your job is to go ahead and cross off that I have said the word that you noticed that I said the word. That is the goal of our bingo. And you'll notice I'm going to do a lot of reflecting on this game that we're playing here. I had you make the bingo card and then I gave you 0 rules for it. We started working through it. And so if you at this point, since I gave you 0 rules, started crossing stuff off or started making notes or started making designs or ignored it completely, in what ways, and this is just for reflection, in what ways were you already applying your prior game knowledge to a game that's integrated alongside a presentation that you have chosen to show up to? If you started engaging with it, were you engaged with the game knowledge, or did you just assume I needed to do something like this? If you didn't engage with it, are you madly checking off boxes now because I'm actually talking about the game that we started? So there are a lot of ways where integrating the game really connects back to what is it that learners are expecting and what is it that learners are applying from their prior experience, and how do we use that and connect with that to really shape the game space that we're attempting to create in our learning spaces. Because one thing I want to note, and this is a great space for it, and I really appreciate that you all are adding the notes in the comments. I do have the chat window open to follow along, so waiting for instruction for me is fantastic. That's kind of the whole point. I purposely didn't say anything so that we could have this conversation now. What happens when students just start engaging, and what is the space going to look like for that? And these kinds of bingo spaces can be used in synchronous learning. They can be used in asynchronous learning as well for very specific reasons. And we're going to, closer to the end of the presentation, get back to how it models habits of mind and what habits of mind are being valued specifically by that particular structure. But thinking through where games are integrated and why is really, really important. So having a vast array of approaches right now, and pointing to the idea that there are a vast array of approaches to the bingo set that I tasked you with, and whether you chose to integrate it, or chose to start it or not, whether you were waiting for my instruction or not, is a really important point that we want to confront about games. There is the likelihood, and I've heard this from a lot of colleagues at even my own university, there are a lot of times when games fail in learning spaces. And one of the things that we really want to pay attention to with games, and so again, the purposeful design of this particular layout, one of the things we want to pay attention to with games is games make us very vulnerable, because play is very vulnerable space. Sue Zinga, and the full citation to that will be available in the annotated bibliography, who is a cultural play scholar, really talks about play as this magic circle. There's lots of controversy around it, but it's a really useful concept for the idea of getting at vulnerability. And vulnerability has been discussed infrequently, unfortunately. It's the focus that I've had recently in MAPACA, because I just feel like we have not paid enough attention to how vulnerable we're asking our learners to be when we ask them to play with us. So we'll use my child as an example because it's always good. So I've told him before, you have 10 minutes to play Minecraft. And then, we have to have dinner, or we have to go do this, or we have to go do that. And 10 minutes are up, and I go down and say, okay, your 10 minutes are up. You need to close it. You need to turn it off. We have this other thing we have to do. And he's like, there's no way it's been 10 minutes. It's been like 2 minutes. No, it's been 10. No, it's been 2. He lost track of time and space because he was playing, because he was very engaged. This is what we want play to do. This is how play operates. And there are a lot of ways that it's very, very cultural and also very, very biological. In one of McGonagall's books, she tells a story about a culture that had food shortage. And so they ate one day and they played games for 24 hours the next day. There was sleep and everything like that. But on the days that they were not eating, they were not hungry because they were immersed in play. And that full immersion, while fantastic for that culture because it survived, is also the vulnerability that we put our students into. If they lose track of time and space, if we're asking them to not be the typical student that they're used to being, the people in the comments saying, I waited for instruction, which is 100% what we expect students to do, what we expect learners to do in spaces, that becomes very vulnerable space for some of our learners, for a lot of our learners. So when we design these games and when they potentially fail, it's not necessarily the game or the design, it's how we're accounting for the play and the vulnerability and the immersion that comes alongside these habits of mind that we're really focused on in our game design. So I just wanted to point that out. And that was the reason that I didn't say to start the game. So by all means, start playing bingo. Let me know when you have one. Okay, so we've been talking about play, and we've been talking about why and the complexities of all of it. And so I want to talk a little bit about, just very briefly, what is a game? How are we defining the idea of game? And one of the best definitions of it that I've seen is voluntary play through unnecessary obstacles. And I love the idea, and I think it's really important for us as learning design facilitators to really think about and exploit to a huge extent this idea of unnecessary obstacles. Where do we put in, can I say free space? Yes, I can say free space. Free space was so that you could just cross it off, but I love that you asked. Unnecessary obstacles are really interesting ways to help us as designers refocus on habits of mind as the goal of game design instead of content knowledge and content knowing. So I'm going to use this. Congratulations on the bingo. I'm going to use this idea over and over as we come back to it when we really talk through, okay, how do I use a series of questions to help my particular design in this? Because, as we just mentioned with the vulnerability, in a lot of ways, learning spaces in classrooms or learning spaces in formal settings where we expect people, any learner to engage, the voluntary nature of it is very gray. It's a huge gray area. It's not as voluntary as just sitting down to play. But there are a lot of times when sitting down to play as a family, as a friend group, is not as voluntary either, because 3 out of 4 people might want game A and the 4th person wants game B, but the 4th person wants to play, so they're still going to join in. Even when kids come up with the rules for a game like tag, they're squabbling. So it's voluntary is a very ambiguous term, but we do want to account for and really acknowledge the idea that when integrated into classrooms, the voluntary nature of a lot of games goes away to a huge extent. And so how do we accommodate for students within that space to help them still feel comfortable? And then just some very general terminology. The game goal is the win state. What is it that you need to, what is it to win a particular game? Game rule or the gameplay and game structure. So how rules, and this is my favorite part of games, it's a series of rules that require us to have fun. Sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but that is 100% how games work. The core dynamic and the game mechanic, these are the 2 ideas that we're going to talk about specifically with learning design. So core dynamic is what a player does to win, and the game mechanic is how people achieve that game goal. So what are the actions? What are the activities? What are the interactions? What are the challenges? What are the quests? There are a lot of different ways to name this. What does it mean to get to the game goal? What does it mean to get to the game to the game win state? This is where educational game designers and learning designers can align and should align, and I'm arguing we all should align game design with learning outcomes, and we should align game mechanics with habits of mind so that these game mechanics are paying attention to fostering ways of thinking, not just engaging with whatever the game, whatever the content is. So Kahoot is a fantastic app, but there are some game mechanic elements of Kahoot that maybe don't align as well with the assessment of that particular content knowledge, or mimic and mirror and facilitate the ways of thinking that align better with some of that content knowing. And so Kahoot can be used, but maybe in combination with other approaches so that we get back to the ways of thinking. So in a Kahoot, especially, I see it used most frequently in math when I work with educators and educational designers. There's a really great book that is included on the annotated bibliography list called Resonant Games, and they worked with a lot of STEM teachers in K-12 in the Massachusetts area, and they also worked with some math teachers, and they were looking at games specifically for that. So we do see an overabundance of games in the STEM field, and in a lot of ways the mechanic, depending on how you're employing the tools that are available, set time limits and set competition limits. And those are useful and can be useful. But then where are some other spaces that the additional habits of mind, the creativity that science requires, the problem solving that science requires, can also be facilitated using other game mechanics that aren't as available in Kahoot? There are ways that we can undermine, to a huge extent, the mechanics that are available to us in Kahoot to start to model the habits of mind that are fostered and expected within various disciplines, especially humanities disciplines. It just takes a little bit more work. And so that's where the focused attention on how does the game mechanic foster habits of mind can be really useful to facilitating learning more effectively. So what I've done is I've taken the questions that instructional designers typically use, game instructional designers use to help us build games to support instruction. And I've added habit of mind questions to really expand what do these questions mean and what is it that I'm focused on? Because there are a lot of ways that when asked what is the instructional goal, a lot of instructors will focus specifically on content. And there's a significant body of content, and there's a need for understanding content on behalf of students. I always use the example of my doctor. I want my doctor to know how to diagnose a series of symptoms, to understand which symptoms are related to other symptoms. And that's a combination of knowing content, the symptoms and anatomy and physiology and whole interesting, complex, chemistry, but then also to problem solve and interact and listen to me when I say, here's when the symptom shows up, or here's what happened before I started experiencing that particular symptom. And that second piece, the listening to me piece and the engaging with what is the context surrounding the onstart of that particular symptom, goes beyond just content knowledge and content regurgitation into habit of mind. What is my typical approach to this situation? And when question A is answered in a certain way, how do I determine what question B should be to get the most effective and useful information? That pattern of intellectual behavior is a habit of mind. And so my instructional goal really shouldn't just focus on content knowledge, but content knowing. What are the ways of knowing, and what are the ways of asking all of the questions and the follow-up questions as they are meaningful within this particular field? And so it comes back to, and kind of the easiest way to start breaking that down is to really sit down and think through, what does it look like to think like a, and then insert your field here. Which then, and I purposely reordered the questions from what they're usually typically educators who are creating these learning spaces start with the content. I put content second to instructional goal because the content can shift and change. There's also a significant amount of research that and I believe I included Bowen's Teaching Naked on the annotated bibliography, but I might not have. He has an entire chapter on where content first exposure should happen and then when a game should happen in relation to that. And I think it's really important to think through the game not as content first exposure, but as the students are fairly comfortable with the content, now we can really get to what are my instructional goals related to ways of knowing, so they know how to work with the content, how to ask questions, how to apply, how to get into the higher order thinking skills related to the content and the content knowing, which come along with an entire value set from the discipline. What does this discipline value, and how do they value this particular information? And then how do we really work through teaching and exploring and experiencing the values that come with those content ways of knowing? Then we can start to determine what is the game goal, because we have an idea of what the instruction can look like, and we started to identify habits of mind, and then we've identified content, so we can better align habits of mind and ways of knowing and knowing about knowing with the content that we want students to play with, so that we can actually establish a game goal that will be meaningful to them. So then the game mechanics can be designed to support exactly that. Okay, so I've broken down these questions. And again, this way is going to be shared with you all, so you'll have access to these questions after this presentation. So what is the instructional goal? Why did I assign bingo? So the italics are my instructional goals for why this particular game mechanic and model and system. And the first is to demonstrate that games can be integrated into a lot of learning spaces really easily and really quickly. And I didn't put it in there because I didn't want it to be a spoiler. They can also create space for reflection to really point out, here's what's going on here, and here's what's not going on here. So I gave you the bingo, and then we didn't talk about it. And then I waited a couple minutes, and then we started talking about it. And so the way that I integrated it into the learning space provided multiple points of connection to the conversations that we're having and that I'm developing here surrounding learning and habits of mind, so that you hit moments where you really attended to, what am I doing and how am I interacting with this? And hopefully, based on my questions, you're also thinking, what other games have I played like this? Or when was the last time that I played bingo? So you're integrating learning, you're integrating this content into your larger framework for ways of knowing, so that you're really starting to develop facility with how knowledge is made and metacognition, and why metacognition is incredibly valuable. So you can think through, how do I apply those same concepts with the learners in my space, knowing that we have a broad range of learners that we're all working with. And then it's also to demonstrate how to support disposition work. So each of the concepts that I pointed out is one of the key words for this particular idea. Building vocabulary and building facility with vocabulary is a really important thing that all of us do across all of our various disciplines. And in this case, game studies has a discipline. It's created itself as a discipline, but it's not connected to any of the more traditional disciplines that we're used to. And it extends far beyond just academia. Anybody who goes to a grocery store, and uses a reward card engages with gamification, because the reward cards are gamifying your shopping experience. Not necessarily as overtly as a lot of other gamification that we experience, but in very specific ways, the store collects all of that data and then puts items on sale accordingly. We need to move product, and we know at this particular location, based on the reward card use, that people have a tendency to buy toilet paper on the third week of the month. I'm making up ideas now. And so we can put toilet paper on sale on the fourth week, because then it'll better align with when our shipments come in, which means we can move the product faster. There are a lot of ways that we can really gamify behaviors, and that we already engage with this. And so we're trying to go to a higher level with that, so that it's a very reflective, very noticed way of engaging with thinking about thinking. And so we're building in the ideas of habit of mind, and dispositions were one of the key concepts on there, so we can focus on, and then again, have time to really engage with, what does it mean to think about thinking? So in this particular space, I've done this multiple times now. What does it look like to think like a learner? What does it look like to think like a learner in a webinar? And what does it look like to think like a learner when we're also learning designers? And how do we reconcile those two ideas? And what does that mean in relation to a game, especially a game mechanic that a lot of us are already familiar with? Content was also a primary factor. Here are the keywords that I want you to have, but it's not just keywords that I want you to have, it's keywords to draw your attention to empowered learning and what empowered learning can look like. Then you get to recognize and mark the key concepts. In most learning spaces, the goal at the end of this, especially when we start talking about the mechanic, is what am I trying to accomplish? How do these game mechanics allow that? And again, this is where I'm drawing very heavily on casual games. This is a recognizable game mechanic. I'm assuming most of you have played or seen bingo in some setting. It occurs in a lot of movies. It occurs in a lot of TV shows. So whether you've actively, purposely engaged in a bingo game or not, you know the basics of it. And so you knew what to do and you knew how to draw. So how much time and effort it took for me to establish the baseline was very, very, very minimal. I could bring in the key concept focus, and then we can start to reflect and discuss in relation to the goals of this particular presentation. So I'm using the questions and the additional habits of mind focused questions that I'm introducing to these more traditional game-based building questions to really connect the game that you then played and engaged with. Okay, so what does this mean for games that you guys can actually use? So obviously bingo is a fun one, but I've got some long-term ideas and some short-term ideas to really focus on the idea of habits of mind. So one of the things that I do with Twitter, and this is where Judith said that you can see me playing games with my students on Twitter. I require students to use Twitter in my class. I teach a web writing class predominantly. So we're web writing in a web writing class. It just kind of makes sense. I assign weekly extra credit. And so some of these ideas just exist as the weekly extra credit in my class. But the habit of mind that I want them to really build is that all writing is creative and all writing is purposeful. And that's where Twitter and the affordances of Twitter come in really handy. You have 280 characters, and then I limit that further because I have a course hashtag and I have a game hashtag. So I'm limiting the characters by, I think it's like 40 when you get through both of those hashtags. So they have about 240 characters to engage with whatever the quest for the week is. This week, and you can see it all over my class feed, what is your favorite snack food while you're studying for finals? So I have beautiful pictures of brownies and Snickers. And then I have controversial ones related to the Crunch Bar, because the Crunch Bar, we're in Hershey country here in Pennsylvania. So the Crunch Bar being Mars is a little bit controversial. According to the tweets coming from students, none of the students have posted Peeps, even though we're also very close to the Peep factory. A few have posted potato chips. There have been a couple outliers with healthy snacks. And then the conversation that engages around that is helping the students then recognize in the reflection that they're writing for class this week that we are collaborating through writing in a space without actively collaborating. So in a collaboration, like a more traditional collaboration group work project, which is what students are used to defining collaboration as, it's the instructor assigns a group or the students select a group and then they work together on a project. And students are realizing through these shares that they've gotten to know each other and they've collaborated and they've built their personalities 100% through writing and their writing choices. So now they're recognizing the writing choices that they've made, which is where the habit of mind comes in and is really the focus. And so then they get to reflect on that particular idea. That's where the game mechanic, the artificial obstacle becomes really, really important to what is this artificial nature? What is the obstacle that I'm putting in their way to make this particular engagement fun? I will definitely follow up with are there alternatives to Twitter? Because yes, there are a few of them. And there are a few ways to get around FERPA with using public social media as well. The other thing that I do attendance-wise, and this is, I also recognize, not accessible to everyone, is instead of saying, if you miss this many classes, I deduct points, I do it the opposite way. If you attend this many classes, you get this many extra credit points. And if you attend this many classes, you get this many extra credit points. This reduced the number of emails I got saying, I'm going to miss class. How many points am I losing? It's, yes, 100% flip the script, positive approach. And students are now building the habit of mind that they are rewarded for showing up to class. I actually have really awesome attendance because they're rewarded for showing up. Are they always with it? That's absolutely up for debate. But the flipping the script and the making it positive has completely changed their mindset in relation to how do we understand this learning space and how do we build a positive learning space together. Changing the attendance policy immediately changed their mindful approach to that particular space. Mindfulness is also a really fantastic way where we can throw in really funny obstacles for students to engage with. So they can engage with journaling, they can engage with all sorts of ways of regurgitating content knowledge in mindful approaches. And I listed some resources in the, because we're running short on time now, I listed some resources to help with that. I can always connect with more mindfulness. Mindfulness becomes gameful when we set artificial limiters. So you can have 5 words on your list, you can have 3 words on your list. And those obstacles are ways of limiting what it takes, but also immediately connecting the student with creativity and openness and readiness to learn. Dice and Jenga and cards are fun ways to bring in artificial limiters to the assignment that we're giving students. So in a writing classroom, I'll bring in cards and I'll just regular playing cards. You can get them at the dollar store type things. I'll give all of the students a card, and then the suit on the card and the number on the card artificially limit the topic that they can engage with, or the types of words they can use, or if I'm feeling really mean, the letters that can exist in their words. So, oh, you got a 9 of hearts, you can't use E's in your words. They're artificial ways to add obstacles to learning spaces that draw student attention. So, I mean, very connected to mindfulness, but it draws student attention to the habit of mind that we're developing in that particular space. Another really fun thing that I've done, because students need a lot of work with what does it look like to have good study habits, or especially if we're outside the classroom space, what does it mean to study and prepare for this type of an exam, or this type of a credential, or this type of, a certification that I need for my workplace. Jenga becomes a really fun way to offload the stressors of studying onto Jenga. So you just build up Jenga like you normally would, and then students start talking through and they start listing what are good study habits for or related specifically to this particular outcome. They are empowered with, and they're contributing the language that they have access to, and then we can help correct and direct that language to what are positive approaches to studying and really help them build those skills and those habits of mind, and what are negative. And so what I usually do is I'll bring in a dice as well, and we'll have 3 positive and 3 negative because I have a 6-sided dice. And student groups will roll the dice and they'll either get 1 through 6. If it's positive, they tell us a positive way, a way that that looks in their particular life. If it's negative, they have to tell us what not to do, how to avoid it, how to subvert it. And then they have to go pull a Jenga block, just like you would normally play Jenga. Instead of being stressed out talking about the student behavior, the stress is all on the Jenga game. They're like, oh no, I have to go and pull one of those Jenga sets. And once you start getting into the game and the Jenga starts getting wobbly, because I'm assuming we've all played Jenga, they really start to recognize, I don't want to engage with those stressful behaviors because then I have to go and pull a Jenga block. They're not connecting with, or even they're self-reflecting. They're not seeing themselves as being attacked or critiqued for their student identity and for falling back on bad study habits. Instead, they're outward putting all of that energy onto the Jenga game and engaging with, I want to avoid doing all of that. Again, not identity, just habit of mind. I'm going to engage positively so that I don't have to pull a Jenga block. So it's a fun way to alter where the stress lies. Color your emotions is really fun in any space. The students just for a series of days, and I usually say 3 days in a row, 5 days in a row, share a picture. I use Twitter. If there are FERPA concerns, obviously a discussion board works very well for this. So just share a picture of a color that describes your emotion for today. Again, students are connecting with who am I and where am I, and how does that prepare me to be an open learner in this particular space? And then their willingness to learn and their willingness to engage with reflection and metacognition is at an entirely different level because we recognize them as whole learners. it didn't take much. It was very little effort, very few unnecessary obstacles on my part, but a way for them to show individuality and uniqueness. And that's all it took to prepare them for openness to engage with this particular session. Okay, a couple of ideas for, you can try these tomorrow. They don't take a whole lot of planning. The other ones take some tech setup and some maybe not for tomorrow. One of my favorite games to play is 6 Degrees of Wikipedia. So 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon or 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. I've heard it both ways. There's even a whole commercial about it now with one of the phone companies. On Wikipedia, if you follow the hyperlinks, you can get from point A to point B. And so 6 Degrees of Wikipedia, and there's an entire Wikipedia page devoted to this game, is all about connecting through hyperlink tracking word A or Wikipedia page A to word B, Wikipedia page B. So I had students in my class engage with this the other day. They had to take the pop culture artifact that they're rhetorically analyzing, and in 6 hyperlink clicks or less, connect it to the Wikipedia page for rhetoric. So we're connecting and we're seeing information. This is massive information literacy, habit of mind, skill development, and practices development. We're connecting the information or the idea that I'm supposed to be analyzing to the foundations of my analysis. And the great news is there are tons of pages for everybody's topic across disciplines, and we're all connecting too. And so I love when it works out to bring the librarians into or have my library session around or as close to this gameplay as I possibly can, because we're really developing the information literacy skills that our librarians are so fundamental in supporting. So there are a lot of ways to connect it. There are sites that students can use that show you how to do this, and there are sites that students can use to not have to put in the work for this one, which is unfortunate, but there are also a lot of ways to do this connected directly to the discipline. Depending on the amount of time you have students share the paths, have students come up with their own word combinations related to the topic in the course, and then compare what path they used and what path other people use. The one note on this one is it is really easy in 6 moves or less to connect any Wikipedia page to Hitler and mac and cheese. And students will find that out really quickly and they will let you know. So be prepared. They really quickly find very bizarre things when they play this game, but the connection across topics as practice for the information literacy practices that are so valued in higher education is really important. We can also start to talk about the skills that are unlocked through these reflections. So again, going back to the bingo page, the bingo squares, the free space was just for fun to interject some play, but the other 8 ideas are really all skills that we're talking about that every time I come back to the bingo page, we reflect on the purpose of those habits within this particular learning space and why. Finding ways to interject those ideas into all of our various learning spaces, even through something easy like a bingo card use, is a really easy way to engage students with the language, to empower students with the language that's helpful to their own learning. A really easy one that you can try anywhere, open palms. You have students just sit and open their palms for 15 seconds. And that in itself just opens us up to, I'm ready to learn, I'm engaged, I've sat, I've focused. There are a lot of various ways to do this. Do you want to get super awkward with them? They have to be kind of older and more mature for this to work, but you have students shake hands and stare in each other's eyes for 10 seconds. Very awkward very quickly, but they notice and they're open to new ideas just because we forced a very specific connection in a very specific way. Again, it's all about the artificial limiters and what that looks like. Okay, so reflection and processing, discussion and questions, because we are out of time. So reflection and processing is really important to this entire process. When we bring habits of mind into the game mechanic portion of our game design and of especially our learning space game design, we really want to provide space for students, for our learners to reflect and process, to empower them with the language, with the habits of mind that they were developing as a part of this entire project, whether it's a small game or a large game. We want to make sure that students have metacognition time. So we're now on to the questions and discussions. And my big question for you all, how can I help you think through applying these ideas? And as Judith reminded us, if you have questions, please use the Q&A and we'll get through as many as we can.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was great. There are a couple questions already.
Sure.
So the first question is about attendance. What do you do for students who miss class because of illness?
So I've had a few different, especially because of the pandemic, I've had a few students question that, they're like, I want to earn the extra credit. I want to show that I'm there. So I will offer alternative ways. Again, because I use Twitter in all of my classes, and I'm teaching writing classes, the habit of mind being developed through Twitter aligns with what I'm trying to do. So that's where the attendance is definitely long-term. What is a space that you have access to, especially a digital space, that models the habit of mind that aligns most closely with the content of your particular space, your particular discipline, your particular course? And I would use that as alternative approaches to getting what was happening in class or engaging in the ways that class made possible, so that the students can then engage in that alternative space when illness arises.
There's been a lot of questions about how do you use these techniques in asynchronous online courses? Like, can you play games there too? And how do you do that?
Okay, so the web writing class is 100% asynchronous. I actually haven't taught it synchronously in years. It just works better that way in my mind. So the students are given a weekly game prompt, and they have 7 days to complete it twice. And then at the end of every 2 weeks, they reflect on it and they show me, here's the work I did and here's why I did it. The first time they say why I did it, it's because of extra credit. And then after that, it really becomes, what is it? I wanted to engage with the question. I really liked the color one, has been hugely popular this semester. And so I've used that one a few different times. I really wanted to share my color of the day. So I use prompts that are like that they have 7 days to work with. And those are offset with, because I'm using Twitter, a different hashtag. There are a lot of ways that this can be mirrored in discussion boards with different tags, different headings, different titles. So instead of saying, here's the artificial limiter time, and none of my, outside of synchronous time for classes, none of these games really have time limits. So they have a broad week. They can engage with it anytime they want to. And they'll just put in, here's what it looks like. Here's what my experience looks like. Here's why it looks that way. And there are a lot of variety to prompts that we can do in that. Personally, I've seen an increase in student participation in that space in asynchronous classes, because they get to really pull their identity into it without being too vulnerable. So that's the line that I'm always playing with those questions.
Would you be willing to share maybe a game prompt or something that I could add to the resources just to get a feel for what it looks like to communicate the prompt to the student? One of the things that I remember from working with you, Nicole, is how I think a lot of times when people think games, they think technology, like especially online,
Yeah.
and that the games can be relatively low tech. They can be paper based, like the challenges that you would give to your students, that they are primarily communicated through paper or like a digital document,
Yeah.
and that they're able to play the game without a special tool to help enable the gameplay.
And I don't have to bring anything. I know that's always a concern with educators, is we're constantly bringing stuff and we have to have all these supplies and all these accesses, and games are pricey. You don't have to have that. I explained this at a conference. I was talking to somebody who worked for Sesame Street, which was totally random. But the person from Sesame Street is like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I'm tricking students into writing more for fun. That's what I'm doing. And you don't need much technology for that. So I like some examples. What does your workspace look like? What does your organization space look like? What are your favorite snacks? What color are you this week? What's your favorite animal? Like, we do really basic, very easy to grab pictures, to grab GIFs. What movies are you watching? What television shows are you watching? What are your favorite books? We do a lot of questions like that because they can be done with marker and paper. They can be done digitally in various formats that are available to us and that meet all of our FERPA standards, and they can be done very publicly like I do on Twitter.
When you do something with like the color post, this is a question that came through. Is there a consideration for visual impairment or color blindness that you have to think through?
Yeah, because you want to make sure that it's as accessible to the largest number of players that you can. And so I'm really broad when I say color. I'm like any color, shape, texture, whatever is resonating with you. And I will say, yoga and writing has become a big thing in my field. And from an accessibility perspective, I always struggle with that one for a lot of the reasons that you're bringing up. Not everybody can participate in yoga. There are a lot of mindfulness practices where it's like raise your hand above your shoulders. Not everybody can do that. And so I definitely try to think through, okay, what can this look like in an accessible way for everybody? So I try to add color, shape, texture to make it broadly accessible across a variety of experiences.
Mm. And then having some choice, just from an instructional design perspective, if you had a couple of options, then the student can lean toward whatever is comfortable for them and accessible for them. There's so many questions. How do you assess the effectiveness of game design to know if they're learning the kind of skills of interest to you?
The reflections, and that's where I know I put it right here. I have students write reflections afterward. I didn't talk about it in this space, but I have a card game that I've designed for face-to-face synchronous courses to teach students argument. And I have a very specific series of reflections, and it's multiple across multiple days that come along with that. And they're mostly classroom-based assessments so that I'm not looking, is their paper better? Because I don't have any kind of a benchmark for that. They only write one research paper. So I look at their language. Are they drawing on and correctly using key concepts and habits of mind language that we've been developing through the reflections? And does it get more complicated and more complex as we go through the gameplay so that they all build and scaffold into each other?
Are there any programs or templates you could recommend to help instructors design or develop games in e-learning?
I cited them in the annotated bibliography that's coming to you. So from that list, sorry, Gilbert, and then there's another one. There's another one on there, and I specifically say e-learning. I just don't remember which one it is. Play to Learn, I think, is the one. Sorry, Gilbert's is fantastic, and it's on the annotated bib that'll be coming your way. And then Play to Learn.
Great. Did you have to change some things for social distancing with the way that you play games?
Yes, because the vulnerability is completely different. I am 100% on board with the, if you don't want to turn your camera on, don't turn your camera on. And so that changes the interaction significantly. And so I've offloaded a lot of my games to asynchronous space so that students can engage. Students can choose to engage if they want to, and students can engage in the ways that they want to, so that the vulnerability is reduced because they're already in vulnerable situations and they're already not having experiences the ways that they were expecting to have the college experience in my particular case. So most of it has gone to the asynchronous, and a lot of it has gone toward self-care, but self-care in a way where I add the unnecessary obstacles like finding a color or finding a texture or drawing a song, so that it's fun and it's not reminding them of their stress, or it's sharing a candy or a food and it's not reminding them of their stress.
I have two more questions if you have time.
Yeah.
How do you allocate the extra credit within the required assessments? Does anyone ever go over the 100?
I've had students get close to 100 for like the entire course. I don't know. Do grades matter? I think if I'm remembering correctly, Online Learning Toolkit had a whole session on ungrading. I don't ungrade, but I'm pretty close to ungrading. So the extra credit is language that I'm using because the students connect with it, and I don't see the points as mattering, but they are also not eligible for the extra credit unless they do the work of the class. I don't want extra credit to just be like well, I did all this extra credit, but I didn't write a single essay.
And it seems like a rhetorical choice too, because bonus is definitely game language, right?
Yeah.
You really want to get that bonus.
You want to get the bonus and you want to recognize that bonus is more. You're learning more and you're choosing and opting into more work.
Yeah. One more question here. Um, any suggestions about using name that element, give me the formula questions in online classes?
Um, so the habit of mind when it comes to that, like naming elements and remembering formulas serve very specific habit of mind functions. You know, we use those in specific ways in real life, and we want students to understand the ways of remixing our our particular approach or our particular content so that it has that particular broad application. And so that's what I would always return to early on in the semester. You know, the time, the around the world, like the timed tests, the flashcard type approach is really effective just to make sure this matters, knowing the element matters. And then as it starts to get more and more complicated and we want them to really start thinking through the remix, putting it into problems and putting it into problem-based learning and thinking about it with unnecessary obstacles. And that's where I would get really outlandish with the unnecessary obstacles. So you need to name and apply this formula to this particular problem, but you only get pink, you know, or you roll a dice and that dice is going to limit something that you can write down or something that you have access to, so that they do have some sort of a funny twist so that it doesn't just feel like a word problem, because I know students really push hard against word problems. So that's what I would do, is pull in some completely outlandish, unnecessary obstacle once they're at a point where they're comfortable with the remixing, so that the habit of mind is really, really reinforced in that particular space.
And for online courses, there are some websites that provide these tools, like throwing a die or dice or pulling a card. Like you can just very basic sites that all it does is randomly generates a card or a dice throw.
Yeah, and so then aligning with all of those, because they're really broadly familiar culturally, really easy for students to access, and they won't really second guess or question this artificial limitation. They'll just work within it. And so they're regurgitating the element or the formula, they're just doing it in a fun way. Escape rooms are a great way to do that. Somebody in the chat just mentioned escape rooms. I've made escape rooms. I've used escape rooms a little bit more complicated in writing classrooms, so I don't use them very frequently, but I've used the concept in like broader campus gameplays that we've put together for other things.
Well, that's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
all the questions that we have right now.
Yeah.
But Nicole has shared contact information. You're very active on Twitter, so that's a great place to communicate with you. And I appreciate everybody's time and attendance today. I will be following up soon with a link to this recording for our registrants, as well as the resources and the SWAY presentation. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. This was lovely.
Yeah, thank you.